So the internet and its ability to connect with others across the world offers us great opportunities for trade and collaboration. However, with these opportunities come new risks, such as the ability to influence states from outside. And we also have risks in terms of the kinds of information that people are sharing, as we have seen with coronavirus and conspiracy theories, and the much lauded phrase fake news in recent times. So we really have a difficult space that we need to think about how we control. Now, some of this information is propaganda, so it might be from states or threat actors or groups. Some of it is misinformation, which is when citizens unintentionally share information, and some of it is disinformation, where it's intentionally shared. So it becomes quite a complicated space, and I want to talk to you today about a few of the strategies that states need to be considering and why they should have social media as a part of their national security policy. And in saying that, I don't mean in an undemocratic way. I'm talking about the need to build participatory platforms that actually engage citizens. Now, the internet and cyber warfare through social media comes under the category of information warfare. So NATO defines information warfare as controlling one's own information space, protecting access to one's own information, while acquiring and using the opponent's information, destroying their information systems, and disrupting the information flow. So this is something that's not new. Of course, it goes back to even Lao Tzu's Art of War. It's something that governments have always done and groups have always done. But it encounters a new field where it can spread and become quite a problem when we talk about social media. So despite these rapid advances that are occurring in technology, states remain very underprepared for this new environment. Fighting disinformation threats in a social media environment requires significant planning in advance, as well as ongoing monitoring and surveillance. So to begin with, I'll give an overview of some of the contemporary social media warfare threats and also the disinformation field. And I won't talk so much about ordinary citizens sharing disinformation, although I will talk about how that can be used as a part of a disinformation campaign. And then I'll give some of the characteristics of the internet and some previous examples that kind of foreshadow why this is quite difficult to control. So the characteristics of the internet, I think, are very important to think about when we think about the kinds of strategies that we need to introduce in order to be able to get on top of these issues. I'll then talk about some of the initiatives that have been introduced to deal with social media disinformation and international agreements, and some of the measures that states should be taking in terms of thinking about how they deal with this issue. So if I just change slides, if we talk about social media warfare, I guess we're in a current environment with coronavirus where these issues really kind of come to the fore. We've got governments that are under pressure. They're dealing with the spread of a pandemic, and the ability to be able to circulate information that is agreed upon, that's solid, that people trust is very important. And the 2020 coronavirus epidemic really highlighted the concerns about the sharing of fake news and information and disinformation in undermining public health responses. So the World Health Organization General Director Tedros Adhanom said in February 2020 that we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. Fake news spreads faster and more easily than this virus. And it was also very clear early on that while people were in crisis or states were in crisis, this provides an opportunity for basically people to take advantage of this kind of power vacuum. because often disinformation is talked about as a form of kind of hybrid warfare, where it's like you're not really going to war, you're stopping short of that, it's undercover and it's easily done. So a European External Action Service report in April 2020 found that states and hostile actors were active in spreading disinformation about the coronavirus. So they found that coordinated campaigns were running across EU states and neighbouring regions, promoting false information and disinformation about the EU and its partners. And they also found that there were continued efforts on redirecting blame for the virus. They found, or they alleged in particular, that Russia and Syria were propagating disinformation about the virus, and that China was actively trying to remove any information about it starting in Wuhan. So some of the misinformation that circulated included information on false cures, as you can see here with this image that says that milk is a potential cure for the coronavirus. That was from an advertisement in the Ukraine, as you can see on social media. There were conspiracy theories on how COVID was part of a new world order to establish control through vaccines. And there's been dangerous information that has been circulated that has actually ended up harming people. So we've had people that have died from drinking bleach, for example, in the United States. And these narratives have also had a direct impact on the health response for nation states, such as the rise of anti-vaccine and anti-lockdown marches or the burning of 5G towers. So information warfare is quite often seen as a form of hybrid warfare, which is a multi-domain approach to adversaries, which employs political warfare, which is warfare that stops short of actual conflict, information warfare, and cyber warfare to propagate ideas. It exploits existing divisions to polarize or destabilize populations from within, weakening claims to power by government. So this form of weaponizing social media has the ability to spread quickly. Automated bot accounts can amplify narratives at an immense scale, and it can be difficult for people to discern what is real and what is an actual user. So although social media platforms have introduced mechanisms to identify and remove bots by identifying markers that indicate false or malicious activities, the technology for the creation of bots and bot-human interfaces also develops at a rapid pace, making their control and removal difficult for providers. So 2 recent studies demonstrate the capacity of bot interference in domestic politics. So one found that a third of a sample of 1.5 million tweets prior to the Brexit vote were from bots, and roughly a quarter of the Paris climate-related tweets were from inauthentic mechanised users. So just to show you a few examples of some of the issues that social media throws up, we could look at, this is an example of propaganda. This is sourced from the New York Times, and this is Russian television, has periodically touched on the issue of 5G and linked it to something that causes the coronavirus. Social media can also, of course, be used for the recruitment of groups, such as this example of ISIS and Al-Shabaab. So that poses issues as well for the leaking of information. If government or military staff have their profiles online, social media can be exploited in that way. But it can also become a threat through marketing, as in the example of the 2016 US elections, where social media was weaponized in order to polarize people. So these are examples of ads that the Mueller report argued came from Russia that were aimed at dividing people, and they were interacting with a large number of citizens. So an inquiry by Special Counsel Robert Mueller alleged that Russia had utilised the social media platforms of US companies in an attempt to swing the US election in favour of Donald Trump by disparaging Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton. So suspicions of Russian interference actually began in mid-2016 when the Democratic National Committee announced that their systems had been breached by a hacker going by the name of Gusifer 2.0, who was suspected to be Russian. The hackers were later determined to be part of the Russian hacker group called Fancy Bear. And shortly after, you got documents appearing on WikiLeaks, released in 4 tranches in the period from April to November. But they also did these weaponized social media posts through marketing, and where they posted ads that were aimed at pitting groups against each other. So they included pro-gay rights ads and pro-black rights advertisements that were targeted at conservatives because those are issues that fire them up. They also had pro-police ads that were running, and ethnicity was one of the key topics of these ads. In an analysis that was done by USA Today found that over 50% of the ads that were suspected to be Russian, or the Mueller report found were Russian, were actually targeted at ethnicity and pitting people against each other. So they found that there were around 80,000 posts made by 470 Internet Research Agency accounts between 2015 and August 2017. And it's estimated that they reached as many as 126 million people. They also identified 3,814 controlled Internet Research Agency controlled Twitter accounts that were propagating tweets. So you can probably hear my cat there making an appearance. So we can see there that this becomes an issue because these posts actually start to reach a wider audience, and social media warfare quite often will pull on issues that are polarizing or divisions that are already inside the nation state and then amplify them through getting people to engage with them and then share those posts. And in the United States, they were actually successful in getting people to turn up at protests. Not many people, but it's interesting, the idea that you could organise protests from outside a nation state within a country. So if we look at social media warfare, Lieutenant Colonel Jared Pryor notes in his article on social media warfare for Strategic Studies Quarterly, he talks about the establishment of botnets and how they are used in social media warfare. So basically you get a combination of bots, which are robots that propagate posts that look like they might be real. There's studies that show many people can't tell the difference between a bot and an actual human. But you also have sock puppets as well, which are people posing as other people that hold particular perspectives. So you can have an example where you get a malicious actor that is dealing on monopolizing on an issue within a nation state, and then they are able to identify topics that are trending, slightly alter the narrative, and try and propagate this wider. So you can see here the malicious actors in this particular diagram are trying to latch onto a larger group with strong ties and really create trouble. So bots are used to amplify narratives that are then spread by group members that are sympathetic to that position. So you might think of the example of 5G and coronavirus. I'm speaking to you tonight from New Zealand. We have had 5G, well, actually 4G. We don't even have 5G yet. 4G towers burnt down within our country because of some of these conspiracy theories that circulate very quickly. Now, if we think about things like the rise of deepfakes, we are entering into a much more dangerous environment where ideas can spread very quickly, and you've got the opportunity to make deepfakes that almost look real. And
one sec.
Sorry, my Siri turning on. And there's studies that show that the average citizen has trouble spotting the difference. There were concerns about this in terms of the 2020 US election, but deepfakes didn't actually make that much of an impact on the election, but it's something that we need to watch for in the future. So if we think about how the internet changes information and what are the kind of policies that we need to promote in order to be able to deal with this threat, we really see the size of the problem. So a theorist called Paul Virilio wrote a book called The Information Bomb in 1999, and he talked about how basically new technologies were enabling a new kind of military spatiality, which was defined by speed and spread rather than actual boots on the ground. And the speed of the internet is one of the key characteristics of how you control geographic space. Okay, and we can see this happening through a few examples. So Moises Naim, in 2011, he wrote a great article for Foreign Policy, which was called the YouTube effect. And he really took this term from an earlier media studies term called the CNN effect, which was the impact that CNN had on Americans when it started broadcasting 24 hours. So in order to fill up that content, they actually profiled other countries much more than they would have in the past. So all of a sudden, for example, Americans were interested in the famine that was occurring in Ethiopia. And Moises Naim argues that the YouTube effect has the same impact on geographic policies. So basically, and the way that information spreads. So if we look here at the example of Syria, much of the narrative over what was going on in Syria was determined by videos. So you can see here a map of trending videos in 2013, and people took these as being an actual kind of witness account and what was going on the ground. And in terms of the international narrative, which then of course impacts on the geopolitical narrative, these videos were very influential. You had singular videos that would shape the course of the narrative. We also have singular images too that stand out and move people. So here's an example from Gezi Park in Turkey, where you had a woman in a red dress who was pepper sprayed, and this image flew around the world very quickly without context and began to become the shaping narrative of these protests. So this is what Moises Naim is talking about when he talks about the YouTube effect, that we're now in an environment where singular images can spread very quickly. At the same time, people thought that people would talk to each other more, and they had a very utopian idea of the internet, a lot of the theorists that were writing on it when it first began. But what we are seeing is cyber balkanization. And by this, I mean that you get polarized groups that actually talk to themselves in clusters. And Evgeny Morozov argues a similar thing, where he says that there's an overload of information that works to reinforce polarization. And this is something that's actually within the algorithms itself. So basically, when you Google, you get back more of the content that is similar to what you just Googled, because the search engines want to be able to offer you content that is the most relevant to you. And what ends up happening is that this means that people end up being in their own kind of echo chamber, that you can exist in these groups on the web that are very polarized. And this, I want to show you an example of this. This is a Twitter map of the news resources that people were consuming after the bombing of the United Nations school in Beit Hanun in 2014 in Palestine. And you can see there that Israelis and Palestinians, the only media that crossed over was Haaretz. So you've got a kind of filter bubble environment that can exist across nations. So you can have groups within nations that are engaging in international narratives that aren't really engaging with the mainstream media within. They're not really getting kind of official narratives. And, you know, if you think about something like coronavirus, obviously we've got a health imperative to be able to hear from the government. The other thing that occurs, and this is what I really want to emphasize today, is that with speed comes instability. And a great example of this is The Innocence of Muslims in 2012, which was a short 12-minute film that was produced and uploaded to YouTube. And from all appearances, it appears to have been uploaded by a just a particularly politically motivated guy. But within a week, it had caused riots in over 50 nations. People died. They actually had to shut down the YouTube in Pakistan for a bit. So one of the things that we have in this kind of social media warfare environment, whether it be from misinformation from our own citizens or disinformation from a threat actor, is an environment that can move very fast. And I think that most states are not prepared for how fast this environment can move. It's also worth noting that this kind of instability suits asymmetrical warfare, because engaging in social media warfare is very low cost, it's often untraceable, which makes it a great mechanism for if you are taking on a larger power. So what are the kind of efforts that are going on to combat information warfare at the moment? Well, there's huge difficulties in negotiating agreement between nation states because there's differing definitions of the kind of information that's okay to be circulated. And there's also particularly issues around human rights and expression. So we had the Budapest Convention in 2001 was mostly dealing with cybercrime, but it did touch on some elements of information warfare. But since then, the closest that we've got is a resolution, which was actually proposed by Russia and had the support of a number of states in December 2018. But we're still lacking a convention or a set of modes for communicating with each other to deal with this issue. And this is really exacerbated, I think, by the way that social media warfare can be easily denied. It can be very difficult to trace as well. And just to give you an example of that, one of the things that occurred in the 2016 US elections was that they looked at the paid divisive ads that were being released on Facebook, and a analyst called Youngmi Kim of the University of Wisconsin looked at a sample of 50,000 paid divisive ads on things like gun control on the platform, and found that over half were from suspicious sources with little to no paper trail, with only 1 in 6 being able to be traced back to a state. And actually, former Facebook chief security officer Alex Stamos, he argued in his analysis of the 2016 campaign, in terms of the internal investigation that Facebook did, that many of the accounts promoting divisive issues were actually people that were engaging in ad fraud. Because the moment you have a popular issue, then of course the advertisements that are on those sites make money. So you might have a polarizing issue, and then you might have fake sites that pop up that are actually there for the advertising traffic. Because in terms of programmatic advertising, it's estimated that only 2/3 of clicks are actually programmatic fraud. So it's a big industry. The other issue is that it often draws upon previously existing divisions within society. So when social media warfare is successful, it's pulling on things that people are already concerned about and amplifying those. So obviously you've got issues in settling down the existing divisions that are within a society. The other problem is that it can be quite difficult to remove or to identify. So the platforms, in particular responding to things like the Christchurch call, which was on the spread of we had a terrorist attack on a mosque in New Zealand where 53 people died, and it was streamed on social media live. And so our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has been working with a number of other world leaders to try and push the platforms to get AI to be able to identify these things faster and ensure that they're removed. However, there's issues around, like, how do you identify these elements in video? Is the AI good enough? But there's also dark social, which is, a large majority of posts are actually shared through things like WhatsApp or Messenger. And once something's on the internet, it can spread very quickly. And you can see this in examples where you have had videos that governments have tried to remove and they keep popping up again. Once they're on social, they can be amplified through the algorithms of social media because they are geared towards engagement. And one of the things with engagement is that the people that comment tend to be people that have strong views either way. A lot of people just lurk or will just, observe posts rather than engage. But it can also be amplified through programmatic advertising. So Facebook has really tried to kind of crack down on this. But if you go into the Facebook ad library, which they set up to have greater transparency over political campaigning, you can still see examples of this kind of advertising that is occurring. So what I want to highlight today is that we definitely need to create technological solutions that work to remove this kind of activity. We also need to create international agreements that create a basis for collaboration where states aren't messing with other governments' internal politics, but we still have issues of the potential of groups or individuals that may want to disrupt social order. And we also have the issue of what people think. How do you regulate what people think? Like some people, I know people that believe conspiracy theories about vaccines. It's definitely people should have a right to their opinion, but these ideas can spread quite quickly. So what are some of the things that we could do to deal with this? I would argue that governments need to start considering social media as part of their national security strategy. And by this, I don't mean creating something that is oppressive, but I mean having plans in place for if there is a crisis. Because the example of Innocence of Muslims shows that social media can often move far quicker than a government can. And so it's really important to have a coordinated communications approach. This is something that I think many governments are starting to do with coronavirus, for example. We've seen in New Zealand, rather than each department putting out its social media posts, you're beginning to see a much more coordinated approach. However, we also need to build consensus. So we need to think about how we actually build these democratic mechanisms within countries. If successful social media warfare comes off exploiting division and polarization, we need to think about how we can encourage people to participate that have different views to us. And I don't think there's any government that is actually really doing this to its full extent at the moment. A lot of government communication is one way, but Estonia, when coronavirus hit, they did a hackathon where they encouraged people to get involved in building apps. We also need to think about education on disinformation. So there's a number of countries that are starting to do this, where they're educating their citizens on how to identify something that might be false information. And Finland, for example, is actually teaching it to school-aged children. Of course, we still need the strategies for identifying bots and deep fakes. So we need the platforms and we need to have the ability to monitor. I think groups like ISIS have shown that governments can really step up in that monitoring and halt that process or curb it somewhat. I'd like to thank you all for having me here today. And I can see that there's a few questions that have come in here. So what are your thoughts on building participatory social media versus pressuring platforms to censor? Should publishers or social media platforms be held to the same kind of editorial oversight that traditional media does? Oh, this is like a very difficult question. Because I think it's not really the role of Facebook or Twitter to be a political censor. And obviously they did when it comes to Trump, but they have always argued that that's quite a dangerous line. So, for example, during the Arab Spring, they refused to get involved in shutting down accounts unless a group is identified as being a terrorist group. So the problem is that could actually become something that positions Facebook and Twitter as more powerful than governments. And so we need to try and keep that platform neutral, I think, in terms of unless it's dangerous information or there's like well thought out guidelines around it, we actually have to be really quite careful about that in terms of freedom of speech. We've also got, how do you think the social media platforms versus nation states friction will play out in terms of safeguarding freedom of expression and spread of misinformation? So this is a really interesting one because there's a number of battles that are going on between nation states and the big social media platforms at the moment. So for example, there's a number of antitrust investigations going on into whether Facebook, YouTube, Google are too much of a monopoly and whether they need to be broken up, and what the impact that they have on the privacy of citizens. So you're actually beginning to see for example, the removal of third-party cookies in programmatic advertising at the moment, because the platforms are starting to legislate themselves or to self-regulate so that they don't have legislation on them. I think we're going to continue to see this kind of battle being played out. I mean, in terms of, the amount that they make, Facebook, Apple, and YouTube, I think, are worth like 1.4 trillion, right? They're bigger than the economy of many countries. So that's going to be an interesting one. I'm just going to keep going through these questions because I know we've still got a couple of minutes here. Please let me know if you need me to wrap up. Should all schools be teaching critical thinking and skills to identify facts, opinions, and plain misinformation? Yeah, I mean, I think they should. And this is a key skill in terms of critical thinking, is the ability to think about where you get your ideas from and how you think them through. So it's kind of the equivalent of, teaching philosophy in schools. But on the internet, we need to be more careful because we could unintentionally be sharing something that's quite dangerous. And I think trying to deal with a health battle that we've got at the moment really brings that kind of thing to the fore. And I think that's a neutral way of doing that, because you've got to be careful about people still being able to have the capacity to have their own thoughts. But you need to make sure that if we go into a crisis like something like coronavirus, you have enough social consensus that your health measures are going to work. So we've got deep fake can be used to commit cybercrime in the era of fake news. How can we protect and detect them? So there is AI out there that can detect deep fakes. So Facebook actually claimed a couple of years ago that they had deep fake detection software that could detect around 95% of deep fakes. Whether that's actually the case, we're not sure. But I think the issue is that, like anything across the kind of cybersecurity spectrum, that we have people developing technologies to try and stop this activity, and then we also have people developing technologies to try and continue that activity at the same time. So it becomes a kind of cat and mouse battle that is going on. I hope that answers your question.